Thank you all. Merci à tous. If you were hoping for a kind of dispassionate discussion between two unbiased journalists, you came to the wrong place. NAHLAH and I have long been friends and colleagues, and we'll try to have an engaging conversation. There is no formal question period. We'll go about 45 minutes to respect the Zoom and the Atwater Library deadlines, but at around 1:15, 1:20, NAHLAH will go to the back for a book signing, and you'll have plenty of time to talk to her and meet the family. I think most of you know NAHLAH, but just for some background, before she became the host of Ideas, she worked and covered wars and conflicts around the globe, from the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Russia's annexation of Crimea. She was a former parliamentary reporter for the Canadian Press, graduate of Carleton University's Master of Journalism program. She's won many journalism awards, a photojournalism award for her story, The Rescuers, and her first book, which I strongly encourage you to get, 1,000 Farewells, A Reporter's Journey from Refugee Camp to the Arab Spring, was a finalist for the 2012 Governor General's Literary Awards. Welcome, NAHLAH.
Thank you.
So, I think that the first obvious question is, you've covered so many wars and conflicts. We've worked on some of those stories together. Mm-hmm. What prompted you to go back to a war that ended 80 years ago? Okay, there we go. Wow.
So can you hear me here? Great. Thank you, Julian, for the introduction. Thank you, Lynn, for the introduction. Before I answer, I just want to acknowledge two things, is that indeed, this is one of my mentors, one of my favorite colleagues of all time. So this is not just a dispassionate conversation. So thank you, Julian, for doing this today. And a huge thanks to all of you for being here, and especially to the family. And I just want to acknowledge how nervous that makes me, knowing that you're listening to everything I'm saying. So if I say something wrong, please correct me. So having said that, as a foreign correspondent, as you know, Julian, it takes about 2 seconds out there before you butt up against the legacy of the Second World War. And I'm stating the obvious, whether it's in the Middle East or in Europe, and I've worked in all those places. So it didn't take long for me, even though I'd studied that history in high school, it didn't take long for me out there to come across that history. But even before that, I'll never forget the first time I visited a cemetery full of young Canadian soldiers who'd been killed in war. It was at the border between Germany and Holland. And just standing there at the sea, I'm sure many of you have seen this, and just having no words and having no understanding of what had happened. So my interest is both because of my interest in war, which is long-standing because of my own family history, but also as a Canadian, just thinking, I need to know more about what happened back there. So when I became a correspondent in London, every year we marked the D-Day anniversary. Every single year we went to Normandy, especially on the big anniversaries. And in 2019, a very good colleague of mine, Stephanie Genzer, who you know, came to us with a few ideas for who we were going to feature. And they mentioned that the Juno Beach Center, which I'm sure many of you have been to in Normandy, were honoring women, Canadian women who had, not many, who had participated, or helped the D-Day effort. And there was Sonia Butt being honored and some of her personal effects being on display. And as soon as I saw a woman's name, I said, yes, we're doing that story, because I'd done years worth of men's stories about D-Day, but not any about women. And so that's where the story started. But then once we did the story and we aired it, the reaction we got was extraordinary. People are like, how is it that we don't know this story? Is there a book about this? Is there a movie? Where can I find out more information? I myself felt like the 5 minutes we put on the air was so inadequate in telling the full story of Sonia. It was about Sonia at the time. Of course, we had to expand it beyond that. There was her husband, Guy d'Artois. There was the whole special operations executive. I don't know about you, Julian. I had no idea it existed. I didn't know there were Canadians behind enemy lines before D-Day, and I certainly didn't know there were women behind enemy lines before D-Day. working for the Allied cause. So all those reasons, plus one last thing, it's part of our history. It's a story that's part of this country's history. And given that that generation is mostly no longer with us, I felt it was an important story to tell. So for all those reasons, that's why we're here.
So once you make the decision to do that story, how do you bring to life two people who have been dead for decades? When you've covered wars, it's hard enough, but the people are right in front of you, the witnesses, the victims, sometimes even the war criminals. So how did you go about bringing to life this amazing story?
Well, Julian, you know a bit about this. If you haven't read Julian's book, you should. North Star, it's about the Confederate history in Montreal, in Quebec. Very interesting topic and a wonderful book. So you know what it's like, telling stories of people who are no longer with us. Well, obviously, family is important. The wonderful thing that this family did, and Nadia Murdoch in particular, is as a member of her family wanting to preserve the history, she had her mother interviewed professionally on tape which I had the privilege of listening to over and over and over again. So that was my starting point, is having that as a spine to the entire book. So the book is very much the story that Sonia told in those tapes. And then on top of that, I had to do the research. And so the National Archives in the UK, the Imperial War Museum, the Canadian War Museum, the Library and Archives of Canada, you know, you've been to all those places yourself. So it really was a treasure hunt, so to speak, and trying to find the details that I could convincingly, convince myself that these are details that were relevant to the story and that they're accurate. I just want to give one example. There's so much discrepancy just on this one fact. When did Guy d'Artois land by parachute in France? Well, there were 4 or 5 different dates out there. And I must have consulted the 30 different pieces of paper around to try to figure out approximately what was the right date. I'm fairly convinced that the date I have now, which was May 23rd, 24th, just after midnight, is correct. You know, I don't know 1,000%, but I'm pretty, I'd say 95% convinced that that is the right date. But it took a lot of work. And I had a lot of help, by the way. A lot of help from a large team of people, some of whom are also here, including Michel Gagnon, who's a wonderful ex-CBC producer and investigative reporter, producer. So lots of help from researchers and archivists too, who deserve a big thank you.
I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but your book is full of amazing details, not just dates. When you first describe Guy, you describe him, you say, Guy was a slight, wiry thunderstorm of a man, and then you said, his mind was lightning fast, he was seldom without an opinion or a burning cigarette between his fingers. So how do you get that kind of detail? Because you're not going to find that at the National Archives.
That paragraph took months and months and months to reconstruct. Every one of those words came from somewhere. The burning cigarette, I mean, there were several photos of him with cigarettes. I also knew from some documentation that he was a heavy smoker. You know, he smoked more than 2 packs a day at some points in his life. So, you know, that detail is there. There's endless descriptions of him in training at the SOE, from his file that I got from the National Archives. I mean, just again, it's like gathering tiny bits of information, literally one word at a time, to construct a paragraph like that.
Here's another detail on Sonia. She's already behind enemy lines, and you say, like clockwork, she'd wash her face every morning with whatever water was available, and then, in a small reach for normalcy, put on a spot of lipstick.
Yeah.
So how do you get that?
That one was a bit easier because she actually says that in the tape. Yeah. So that one, I didn't have to verify that one. I mean, I'll take her word for it.
Let's talk briefly, very briefly, about the 2 main characters, Sonia and Guy. What was it about their childhood, their upbringing, that would prepare them for an amazing and dangerous World War II mission?
Yeah. With Sonia, again, I know her story far better. That was always the Achilles heel throughout this, is that I knew her story better because she told it in that tape. She had a difficult childhood. She had one brother, Derek, who was older than her. They were kind of a two peas in the pod. She was a bit of a tomboy, so they spent a lot of time together. But once they were separated into different boarding schools, she was effectively on her own. She had a difficult relationship with her mother. Here's an example of the kind of independence that she developed very early. When the war broke, or just before, she was stuck in the south of France at boarding school. And all the other children had been picked up. Most of the other children had been picked up, as she had not been. Finally, word comes from her mother, who was in the UK at the time, that she should make her way to the UK. So on her own, crosses from south of France, 15 years old, at a time of war, or beginning of war, with nothing to her name but a small bag and a toothbrush, crossed the border without ID, spent the last of her money at the Gare du Nord in Paris, got all the way to Horley by going to a hotel that knew her mother to ask for a bit of money and to get word to the mother that she's coming, and finally makes it to the station. It's about 1,500 kilometers that she's crossed alone, and no one's there to meet her, so she walks 5 more kilometers to get to the house where she was going. So this is the kind of independence that this young woman had. So that is exactly the kind of person the SOE wanted, people who could operate completely alone. And she knew that like the back of her hand.
Yeah. And Guy?
Guy is effectively becomes a military man quite early. He joins the militia in 1934. He was still, just starting his life when he begins to show interest. He's physically agile. He's a natural leader. And so he shows an interest right away, immediately, when he's over in the UK, in working in special work. He says that in his papers when he's interviewed by some of his superiors. He says he wants to do special work. He wants to be a parachutist. He wants to do work behind enemy lines. So he's already expressing an interest. And so, and of course, growing up at the time between the wars, I mean, his life is defined by war. He's born on the day that Vimy Ridge battle begins. And that's the water he swims in until the war begins. And in his own words, in a different interview that he does that I finally accessed, the moment he knew there was war, he was in line to sign up. So he was looking for adventure. He was looking for something different, an important role, something special, different than others. And so he too he was once described as I think the perfect soldier of fortune, and that the SOE couldn't, or the persons who trained him in Canada and sent him over said they could not wait to tell the UK about him. Wow. Because he was the perfect recruit for the SOE.
So you have these two brave future soldiers. War breaks out September 1939, and I think it's important to remember that every high school kid now knows what nobody knew in 1939, right? That the war would be over in 1945 and Hitler would be defeated. But in 1939, that was far from certain. Yeah. You didn't know who was going to win. In fact, it looked like the Nazis were going to win. You didn't know how long it would start. Let's talk briefly. Churchill sets up the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, and he talks about setting Europe ablaze. Mm-hmm. What were the challenges? Guy was a natural soldier and they wanted him, but Sonia was a female. Mm-hmm. What were the challenges she faces when she wants to join the SOE? Right.
So at some point, and again, you see this in the documentation, it dawns on the people who are recruiting, these people ordinary people to do extraordinary things, that actually women might be really well suited to these roles. So why? Because they wouldn't raise suspicion as much. They could be just cycling by and carrying money or equipment or weapons. And so slowly they began to recruit more women. It appears as though some of the instructors were not so keen to have the women, joining them on these instruction courses. And they were explicitly barred from combat. Women were not allowed to be behind enemy lines, and that was explicit. And so there seemed to be some resistance, and you could see it in the descriptions that people provided of some of the most accomplished women in the SOE, being run down and underestimated and given low marks, and said, well, her head is not in this work. She can't focus. She's too focused on the men in the group. All these terrible kind of judgmental, oh, she's been engaged twice. I mean, so what? You know, all these things that really exposed a sexism that was really, there was no effort made to hide it. These women were really underestimated at every turn.
You quote, there's a report on her, and it says like, he says, she's very nice, wholesome, and full of animal vitality. And then it says, probably without exercising her critical faculties, being obstinate and lacking in subtlety, this is rather a drawback.
Yes, and I think at one point that same person says, you know, her skills might be more useful had she been of another sex.
Yeah.
And I, as a journalist, and I do have to be clear, this is a journalistic exercise for me. It had to adhere to all my usual journalistic, you know, standards. I got pretty angry reading this stuff. It was very emotional, you know, listening to people judging a woman kind of based on very superficial things. Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about some of the risks Sonia ran. Now, remember, these agents are being dropped behind enemy lines in occupied France, right, where they're completely surrounded by Nazis. And when you talk about 4 women in the SOE when they were captured, you say in captivity, one by one they were tortured and then given lethal injections. So this was extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
Talk about a couple of the close calls that Sonia had.
It's heart-stopping when you read some of these stories. Excuse me. One of which I heard very early on when I was doing the research, because she tells it in more than one place, is that, I should just give you the background. When Sonia landed, it was her 5th time jumping out of a plane, or doing a parachute jump, and she botched the jump. And she blacked out for a moment and injured her shoulder and her back. And she couldn't disengage from the parachute. So that's heart-stopping enough. But her parcels that came with her had clothing that supported her story, because everyone who goes behind enemy lines has to have a story, you know, a whole new persona that explains who they are and why they're there. So those parcels were picked up by a German convoy. And so Sonia decided, and the circuit leader decided, that as a result, she should live out in the open. That and in doing so, she would, you know, avoid suspicion. Well, that can't be the woman who just landed here. Why is she hanging out at the black market restaurants? And so she began living openly and going to the black market restaurants. Anyway, that's the background, which of course were frequented by German officers. And often you'd have to share tables with these officers because there wasn't a lot of room in them. And so one day while she was sharing a table with one of them, her purse was hanging on the back of her chair. It drops with an unmistakable thud of something heavy. And the officer goes to reach for it, and she grabs it first, and in her mind she says, thank God I did that, because had he grabbed it, he would have had no trouble discerning that there was something metallic and lethal in the purse. And there was a pistol in there. And so that's how closely she evaded being caught that one time. And there were many other times.
And she gets caught at some point, and you know, she faces 2 German soldiers.
Indeed, yes. She's in one town. There's mayhem and changing of hands. You know, first it was the Americans, and then the Nazi forces. And she is the person she's with is accosted. He's held as a human shield. She herself is accosted by 2 German soldiers, and then has to wait until, you know, basically her friend is liberated, and then the 2 of them could walk away to safety. But, you know, met some really horrific incidents along the way, and saw some really horrific things along the way as well. And at the very end of the war, when Le Mans was liberated, there were women being taken away to the center of town to, you know, for retribution, to shame them as people who had been consorting with Nazi officers.
The collaborators.
People had seen Sonia in these restaurants. Some of them had taken her for either a German or a friend of a German. And so the 2 men with guns took her and grabbed her and took her towards town to also have her head shaved and to shame her in public, until she ran across some of her, resistant colleagues and screamed at the top of her lungs. And they vouched for her that she was indeed loyal to the Allied cause. So again, the risks were, every minute there was a risk.
But it shows how good a job she did as a spy, because even the Allies thought, didn't know who she was.
Yeah.
The book is, of course, ultimately a love story. So you've described the wars, but let's talk a bit about how Sonia and Guy fall in love.
Yeah.
And also, unlike, there are people here whose parents maybe lived through the war, but what made their love story different than other couples who had to live through World War II because they were separated?
Yeah. Well, like so many couples back then who met, in the urgency of war, their romance was very quick. I mean, from the minute they met until they got married was just a few weeks, a few months. They met in training. They met in Scotland. The very first day they ever met would have been in London when they gathered this group, this cohort of possible SOE agents. And then it was in Scotland that they actually began to fall in love. And then they spent every minute together while they were training. When it was time to go to France, can I tell the story where they get separated?
Absolutely.
Okay. They were hoping to go in together. They were hoping to be deployed as a couple and pretend to be a couple. So they get married kind of under that premise. And afterwards, the head of the F section, French section of the SOE, brings them in and says, "I'm very sorry, but you are not going together because it will not be good for it's a security risk to send you in together." And so at the moment, she says, "Well, if that's the case, I'm not going to France. I'll go back to my old job." So she accompanies both of them to the airport, watches Guy take off, and she's distraught. She's very upset. And so his name is Morris Buckmaster, looks at her and says, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" And she says, "Yeah, you can send me on a mission as soon as possible." So she changes her mind, deployed 5 days later, and in that become a very rare species of couple back then, which is a couple who were both behind enemy lines. Because most women back then, of course, weren't. And so they were left behind, whether, were UK or Canada or the States. They were all at home. They could maybe even send a parcel to their loved ones. But she was an anomaly in that they both were behind enemy lines, and neither of them knew where the other was. And they were that way until France was liberated. So for months, all through that summer, they had no idea whether the other person was even alive. So that's how it was different, very different than other couples.
Now, as any good love story, there's a bit of a triangle, a bit of a Casablanca twist in the story, where Bogart meets Ingrid Bergman and talks about two people's problems and not meaning much in the middle of war. Talk briefly. You should maybe cover your ears about this if you don't want to know about it. But talk briefly about Sydney.
Yeah. Sidney Hudson was an experienced SOE agent. He'd been behind enemy lines already when he meets Sonia. He'd been captured actually and imprisoned for 15 months, part of that in solitary confinement. We don't know, I don't know, again, I'm speaking now as the researcher journalist that I was with the story. I don't know how it is that he and Sonia met and why they had a short interaction, because what I understand is that she was with Guy. They had not made a commitment, but there must have been some kind of rupture or a break or a pause, and so she meets this older, much more experienced SOE agent, and immediately there's a spark. They meet a couple of times, and then she realizes that he's married and decides, no, this is not for me. So nothing happens, and somehow she makes her way back to Guy, and they get married and all of that, and then they were separated during the war. So fast forward to May 29th, when Sonia lands in France. She's met by a committee, her reception committee. She sleeps the night in a safe house. The very next day, she's taken to meet her circuit leader, and that turns out to be Sydney. And so that poses a difficult moment for Sonia and for Sydney. And I have to say, again, as a human, not as a journalist and a researcher, but as a human, you have to feel some empathy for the difficult times that these young people are living, and not knowing from one moment to the next whether you were going to die or live. And so the two of them, while they're on the ground in Le Mans, they form a relationship.
And I think part of their cover is that they have to pretend to be a couple.
Well, that was always the case.
So
they were already acting. That was their stated plan, was to act like a couple because it helps as a cover. Exactly. And so then the fiction becomes a reality for a time. And then at the end of the war, should I keep going to that?
Yeah, it's a great story.
When Sonia meets Guy and finds out that he's alive and knows that he's alive, she decides the first thing she's going to do is tell him. And so all that bravery and courage followed by a very brave act, which is going to her husband and saying, this marriage matters to me, here's what happened. And we will never know what those conversations were like. We will never know how they found their peace, but they did. And built a beautiful family and moved on to a wonderful life in Canada. But yeah, we will never know what it took to find that peace, but they did.
So let's end now with what happens after the war. It's 1945, the couple is reunited, they're deeply in love, they come back, and slowly some of the story emerges. The headlines, I love some of your headlines. It was like, she ate with Gestapo, killed some? Why, sure, right? And then there's another one, a picture of her packing favorite gun, Sonia shot up Nazi car, right? So
which is true, by the way, but it's just the headlines were cringeworthy.
And then, you know, their romance was called one of the greatest of this war, right? Talk a bit about that early reaction, and then we'll go into some of the challenges that Sonia felt.
Yeah, it just so happened because of boring logistics that when they returned from the war or decided to relocate or to come back to Canada, Guy left first, and then Sonia followed. And so they took different vessels across the ocean. So again, another courageous act by Sonia, going to a whole other continent, you know, not knowing what to expect there. So they move here, and so the day Guy arrives is the day Canada discovers that there were men behind enemy lines. They had no idea. I saw the headlines. It was the Canadian press, bless them, writing about these brave, mostly French Canadians who were serving behind enemy lines, and you know, the country finds it an incredible story. And in the course of these stories, Guy features prominently. He's one of the people who's interviewed over and over in these stories. And in the telling of his own story, also tells the story of his wife, who's shortly arriving in Canada. You can imagine the press. I mean, I can imagine how I would have reacted. So there was quite a bit of excitement and buzz, and her photograph actually appears in the papers before she even lands here. And she's described in one of those photographs. It's a photo of her that's now been placed in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It's her in Versailles. Oh, you're sure? Okay. It's her. No, not.
Well, there's also one of her holding a wedding ring and a revolver.
Right. So that's the kind of thing. Yeah, that's the kind of thing. It's a stage photo, obviously. And she's described. She's wearing a uniform. She's standing outside the Palace of Versailles, and she's described underneath as d'Artois bride. And so there, you know, we have to remember the context, the time. But I can imagine for someone like Sonia, who would put her life at risk, that this would not have been a welcome way to be depicted in the papers. And having had to use some of those papers to verify some facts, I was amazed at the number of errors and the number of mischaracterizations. I'm sad to say, some were excellent, of course, but the mischaracterizations of Sonia and Guy's stories. And you know, some of just as one other example, you know, one article describes perfectly her height and weight and something else about her physical appearance, but says nothing about Guy's. So very sort of a double standard. But I can imagine how Sonia would have been disappointed with that kind of reception. because it really belittled her role in the war and what she did. Yeah.
And I want to talk more about that belittlement. Just before that, politically, they risked their lives fighting the Nazis. And you talk briefly about a scene in Quebec where dozens of prominent Quebecers sign a petition asking the federal government to stop the deportation of a French citizen in Quebec who's a known collaborator with the Nazi occupation. How do you think Sonia and Guy would have felt, right? They come home here and suddenly they see that Nazis are being tolerated in Quebec and in Canada.
I tried to answer that question. I tried by looking, listening to the tape. Sonia talks about that incident and talks about that time. The only glimpse I have actually of how they felt is what Sonia says on tape, which is that she felt as though, she said, Guy and I felt as though, these are not exact words, just paraphrasing, Guy and I felt as though we had lost the war. So coming and hearing, people talk about their support for the other side in France and that kind of thing, it would have been incredibly difficult. But I tried to get more on how they might have reacted or felt. It was really hard. There were some dead ends I couldn't get past. And so that's my only glimpse into how they would have felt. And one could imagine, having put yourself, body and mind, at risk and coming back and finding out that there was someone literally operating down the road from where Guy was operating, like literally an hour away in Lyon, who might have even been responsible for the deaths of some of Guy's and others, men and women. Having safe haven in Canada was obviously a distasteful thing.
Then Sonia faces some huge obstacles as a woman coming back to Canada in the 40s and the 50s. When I was reading the book, the war ends and they're heroes, and then I look and I say, well, I've got like a third of the book to go. And as you'll see when you read the book, it's because there's this whole final chapter and in many ways a final battle that Sonia has to wage. So let's end by talking about that. You mentioned briefly her treatment as a war bride, and you say, let me quote here, you say, Sonia had yet to be fully recognized for the lonely landing she made in France, for the bullets she dodged, for the countless times she put herself, body and mind, in harm's way. Now she was Mrs. d'Artois, full stop. How hard was that for somebody of Sonia's character and steely reserve?
Again, I can only give you a sense of what I think it would have been, because she does not explicitly talk about that. I'll do it by telling you a story. After Sonia moves here and Guy, both of them are recognized. I mean, Guy, I need to just give you a tiny little thing. Hopefully we have enough time. He helped organize and train about 3,000 men in the Charolles area. So, receiving weapons from the UK, organizing this group of people, who are let's just be clear, were already organized, already doing their own thing, but who needed assistance. And so he provided weapons, he provided his military know-how, he built them into units, platoons and battalions, and he led one of them on his own, and conducted raids and that kind of thing. So he did some incredible work on the ground and immediately was recognized for his work. So I just want to make sure we mention that. And Sonia also recognized very quickly one of 5 women who were named as members of the Order of the British Empire, the civilian division. And one of the more senior members of that list, 5 women, Pearl Witherington, some of you might have heard of her name. Very, very accomplished SOE agent, did a lot of work, also organizing and training, much like Guy did. And she wrote a letter and said it publicly, I'm not accepting this award because there was nothing civil about what I did. And so this kind of prompted a bit of a rebellion. And it became a subject of discussion because no one wanted to admit that these women had actually been in combat roles, that they were actually in uniform, not on the ground, of course, but they were women of the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or women who had been, with the Fannies. Anyway, so after a year, the king sends another decree or letter, I saw copies of it, where those same 5 women are moved from the civilian division to the military one. And so that's a massive win, huge victory for those women. but just a tip of the iceberg of the battle it took to actually recognize these women in the same way that the men were. And in fact, the highest ranking woman in the whole French section of the SOE, Vera Atkins, who was so integral to the work of the women there, and everybody actually, but she was especially kind of a den mother to the women and a good friend to Sonia. She was not honored with anything until she was late in life. I mean, she was not given any awards, and she had done all the hard work to track down all those agents who never made it back, including many Canadians. Again, these are stories we don't know. I mean, I didn't know. Maybe you know. I didn't know these stories. So she did all that hard work to try to figure out what happened to those people who never came back. So she was not honored until very late in life.
And you talk about how the bearing of the hidden story, the denial of the role of women, continues up until 1994. There's a D-Day celebration. Tell us what happens, and one of the speeches that seems to ignore the role of women.
Yeah, I'll just say that, again, my sense is that at least later in life, that Guy had more interest in the kinds of remembrance ceremonies or activities than Sonia did. This particular ceremony in 1994 was after Guy had passed. And Guy had gone back in 1984, his last time, going back to Charolles, the area he was serving in, and he went back to the ceremony then. And it was an amazing experience for him, where he actually got to fly over the area and see where it was that he landed. He had never seen that before. So that was Guy. Sonia, after Guy passed away, goes to one of these ceremonies. She goes to Normandy, and she's one of two women there. She's an SOE agent, the other is a nurse. And the main Canadian contingent, I'm not sure what to call him, spokesperson, stands up and gives a speech and talks about how, we need to honor these men and remember their stories. And he says, because unfortunately back then there were no women.
And she's standing
and they're
right there in the crowd.
in the delegation. So somehow he missed the memo about the fact that there were women there. So and interestingly, Le Monde writes about this, and that's where I discovered this. Is a French paper, writes about this. Well, that's strange that guy says that. There are two women sitting in the audience, and they really make a big deal out of it. So that's where, again, back to the research question. Sometimes you just get little scenelets, from different sources, and they enrich the story that much more. Yeah.
The book ends, thanks to Nadia and other members of the family, with a successful attempt to get Sonia to tell her story. You talk about the recorded interview, and you say towards the end of the book, for the first time she was fully recounting her past victories and mistakes, her sacrifices, her choices. In her own voice, she was finally telling her story on her own terms. How important do you think that was for Sonia and for the family?
I feel like, they should answer that question.
Well, how important was it for you to have your mother tell her story in her own words?
This is Nadia Murdoch, her eldest daughter.
For me, it was important that the next generation, the following generations, hear about this story, even though my mother wasn't fully aware of that importance because she minimized what she did. And it was very important to me that, this generation get to hear the story, yeah, and know what their grandmother and great-grandmother did. So that's it.
I agree.
Thank you. So if I may add to that, if people have been saying, what have you learned from this process? I've been saying it all throughout, that how important it is for these stories to be told, and what an amazing thing to record your own parents and to have that story known. And I've been saying it to people, is that maybe those people aren't there anymore, but maybe you remember stories that they told, and the importance of gathering those stories and documenting them in some way. I think every family in this country, somehow or other, its history is intersected with conflict, with war, with adversity of some kind. And I think those lessons are worthy of documentation, if not for the actual family, but for the rest of us. Because, the lessons I learned from this book, we can talk about that.
Well,
if you
let's
like.
end.
Yeah.
Let's end on that point. The lessons of the book. The book is about World War II. It's about amazing adventures. It's about a love story. But I felt ultimately the underlying theme of your book is about choices. Choices that Sonia and Guy had to make, and choices that we all have to make today. So can you talk a bit about kind of the lessons you learned and why this book is so important for you now in 2024?
Sure. I want to say, just to set up the answer to that, is there is a moment at which Guy and Sonia finally find out, after months of training, what it is they're being trained for, because they didn't know throughout exactly what they were going to do. And they had every opportunity to pull out. That was a choice given to them, and it was made clear. Okay, are we running out of time?
No,
okay, I'll make it quick. Running out of sorry, they had every opportunity to pull out, and they didn't. They went. And even Sonia, having said, I'm not going without my husband, also went. So listen, history tells us things. I don't believe, no one believes that history repeats itself, but there are lessons from history that we can apply to today. I've said this before, I don't want to overstate things or be alarmist, but we are living at an inflection point in history. We are, when, literally book-burning authoritarians are on the ascendant. Here we are in a library. And I think that we can learn from these lessons in the following way. What is our role when things become difficult, when there's conflict, when there's adversity? What hat will we wear? And of course, we can't all wear the same hats. Everybody's got different hats. So will you follow in the footsteps of Sonia and Guy and do that kind of work? Are you going to be a conscientious objector who reminds people of the perils and the horrors of war and refuse to engage? Will you be a protester and do exactly that as well? Or will you be one of those people who, at the very minimum, and I think that is a very minimum at a time like this, who engages with the news and who can bear witness to the horrible things that are happening around the world? Or maybe be someone like you and other people who foster conversation and who keep doors open to imagining what peace might look like. But we all have to consider these choices and never forget that we have to make those choices. Like, we can't escape that. We're all members of this society. We're all living this history together, whether we like it or not. What are you going to do? What's your role? And so I'd like to think of this book as an invitation for us to think about that. And that's why history matters, to remind us what possible roles there are.
I think you can see when NAHLAH was posted in London, unlike many correspondents who would, quickly chase after news, follow the puck, she had a reputation of always sending ideas back to the desk saying, let's do this, let's do that. And of course, it's totally fitting that she would end up at the host of Ideas. And I think you could see why she's a great storyteller, but also her book is so rich with those ideas. So I really encourage you to read this book, her other book. She'll be available for a chat and a book signing in the back. So a big round of applause to the family and to NAHLAH.